All right. Good afternoon. I'm John Mancini, and I'm happy to have you with us today on our interactive working session. We're going to do this in a little different format than we normally do for a webinar, in that there really is only one canned slide, which I will get to in a minute. And then we're just going to chat. And so this is kind of open to all of you all. I contacted many of you before the event and asked you to provide any questions, and I've gathered those together and tried to organize them into some sort of a coherent conversation that we all might have. But the floor is really yours, and it's open to you. So please don't hesitate to comment and ask questions. You have a question button that can do that, and I'll try to keep tabs on that. I should also indicate that we also are live streaming to Facebook. So if any of your friends comment about that, that's why that showed up on there. So glad to have you here. We have, I'll allow my panelists to introduce themselves in just a second. But before we get started, I just thought my one slide, since I said we would have a slide, this is being brought to you by QAI and by Konica Minolta and by DocPoint. And these are the capabilities of QAI and DocPoint, just so you have a sense of what they do, primarily for governmental entities, but not exclusively. And so when you think about all the different components of an intelligent information management strategy, from capture to storage to connectivity and monitoring systems, accessibility and automation, that's really at the heart of what QAI and DocPoint do. And that will conclude my commercial for the day. And I will stop the share and go back down to connect with all of you all. So here's everybody, and it's glad to have you here. And as I said, my name is John Mancini. Those of you that might know my name or may have gotten in the past hundreds of emails from me, that's reflective of my past career, which is that I ran AIM, the Association for Intelligent Information Management, for about 20 years. For the past 3 or 4 years, I've been doing consulting with a variety of different solution providers in the space, QAI and DocPoint being two of them that I've done some work with. And so what we thought we'd do with this webinar today is to, as I say, structure this in a little bit different format, so that we basically focus on questions. The idea is that everybody has sat through a gazillion different canned PowerPoint presentations, and the effort here is to have something a little bit more responsive to what the questions that people have. So let me allow my panelists to introduce themselves. And Scott, why don't we start with you, and then Olivia, we will go to you, and then Jay, we will go to you after that. So Scott, take it away.
Great. Thank you, John. Yeah, I appreciate everyone joining this morning. So introductions for me. So I'm the Director of Operations with DocPoint Solutions, QAI, KM. So my daily responsibilities are mainly centered around deliverables to our customers, and that can be anything related to development, migration of content, and general automation of business processes. I also spend a lot of time on the conversion side as far as the paper digital conversions go. And the teams I work with really are marketing, pre-sales, and our senior architects. So I'm responsible ultimately for gathering up to signing off on all the requirements, making sure the scopes of work are accurate. And that's in a nutshell, that's what I do on a daily basis. So Olivia, why don't you go ahead next?
Hi, I'm Olivia Stewart. I'm the senior SharePoint architect over at DocPoint. So my day-to-day role, I'm helping design the platforms, properly configure, especially Office 365 more and more now, but sometimes some other SharePoint environments as well. Been working in the SharePoint space since before it was SharePoint 2003. So we have a long history. And the key piece of my role is also in working with the QAI side and making sure that we have a good understanding of how to integrate the pieces that they're doing into what it's going to be on the cloud solution.
Terrific. Jay.
Hey, everybody. My name is Jay Leesk. I'm the Director of Strategic Accounts and Solutions for AvePoint Public Sector. It's a fancy way of saying I'm the lead strategist for our federal team. I've been with AvePoint for 5.5 years. I've been supporting the federal government for a little over a decade now. And I've been in the collaboration space for 20 or so years. So I have gotten to see a lot of the conversations around migration migration from the early versions of SharePoint, Olivia, that you were mentioning to now. I remember when SharePoint Online first came out and everyone said, this is our last migration. And much like when they said email is dead, they really were wrong. But it's been an interesting career looking at the Microsoft stack and looking at how the federal government uses it and could use it. And so it is, I'm very excited to be part of this conversation. And if you're wondering why AvePoint is here, so first of all, I very much appreciate the relationship I've made with these three people, but also DocPoint and QAI are strategic partners for AvePoint when it comes to migrating and managing the SharePoint stack. So I'm very excited to be part of this.
So it's great to have you with us. I should have mentioned that on the front end. One of the things that QAI and DocPoint pride themselves on is the strategic relationships that they have with partners. And that basically allows them to broaden the capabilities into a whole network of people that focus on particular aspects of the intelligent information management continuum. So I have a bunch of questions here that you all have submitted, and I should have told you guys this in advance, but I've kind of organized these into some clusters, and I'll put you on the spot. And I've also decided that I'm going to have a little bit of an order to this so that everybody's not tripping over each other. So I will plow through my little organization from the questions that people teed up in advance. And we're happy to answer any live that people have that you want to also push out. And I'll be watching the question button to make sure that I get those. So the focus is M365 and particularly migration into M365. And so that's what we're going to try to answer questions on today. So let me start with the first one. And Jay, I'll put you on the spot for this one first, okay, which is that, why migrate to begin with? Why should I migrate from an existing ECM system into M365? And are there particular things that I should consider in making this decision? Was the question that people posed. So take it away.
Okay, so why should I migrate is a very large question in and of itself. And the short version of that answer is really, it may or may not be the right move for you, but some of the reasons you might consider migrating to Microsoft 365 from your existing ECM solution is one, are you paying for multiple licenses? And there are records teams that keep all their records in a tool like OpenText or Documentum, but then the IT teams pay for enterprise licenses for Microsoft 365. And now we are licensing people for very similar functionality across multiple systems. And if I have heard one organization as a whole cry out, do more with less, it's the federal government. It is, we have to streamline what we're licensing and how we're using it. Well, what better reason to look at Microsoft 365 for content management than we're paying for it? When it comes to factors for what you need to consider when you're looking at that, I have heard time and time again, especially in the past, we don't put PII in SharePoint, or we don't put records in SharePoint. And as organizations have started to really look at Microsoft 365, there's become a real conversation of, well, what do we put there? And should we allow that? And so when we talk to our customers and potential partners about migrating to Microsoft 365, we are talking about analyzing your data and understanding what's there. We are talking about evaluating the technology and what are you getting in the destination, from SharePoint to Teams to different types of workflow, native and third party. You have to really look at what's there and what's possible and have a conscious decision of how are we going to use it. I could probably go on for 20 minutes by myself on that one, but Olivia, Scott, I'd love to hear a little bit about what your thoughts are, and maybe we keep going around robin on that one.
Olivia, why don't you take it away?
Well, one of the factors, and we've seen this come up a lot with some of our federal clients, is the life cycle of other platforms that they have, and something's about to be end of life, or there's a push to move something off. And then, to what Jay was speaking on before, wanting to streamline the licensing. rather than upgrade the existing legacy software. It's like, okay, can we do this in M365? Is there a way we can get this done? So a lot of time it's about the life cycle of what your current platforms are. And there may be a push that they're coming to end of life. Let's streamline this, bring it in, and move from it there. And then also, and especially in the past year with more remote workforce, having some cloud availability. Everything doesn't have to be 100% on a VPN, but it's still secured. That can be another push for, we're seeing that more and more now, being that, oh wait, we've got a really distributed workforce. They're going to stay that way. So we've got to consider that.
Yep.
Yeah, and adding on to those are great comments. I think I'm going to kind of second what is that existing solution that you're using, and does that meet your current needs, and is it going to meet your future needs? As these systems age, the capability you may need now may not be available, 2 years from now. So if we're talking about a potential move to 365 environments, I think those are the things that really, really need to be identified. One other thing is compatibility. Is there a need for this to be, accessible from your phones, from your tablets, different platforms? Is that mobility available in your current system? If it's not, then maybe that's a time to consider moving your content to 365. Like Jay said, there may be something you're using right now that works for you, and it does meet your needs. So should you just automatically switch everything? Not necessarily. We love that platform. However, like you're reviewing your monthly bills, and do you want to keep incurring that expense of two different platforms? Olivia and Jay both mentioned, if you're paying for that 365 environment, do you want to use that rather than paying for two completely different systems? So,
do you guys find that the conversation has changed as the capabilities have been enhanced on M365? It used to be that, it was sort of like a wink, wink, nod, nod, doing real records management on SharePoint, but a lot's changed with M365 in those automated capabilities. Has that kind of gotten people asking those kinds of questions like, I wonder if I could get away with one less system along the way?
Mm-hmm.
So
go ahead.
So here's a question. Here's a question that just came in. And I think it probably reflects a lot of the challenge that people have right now with M1921 deadlines, and this idea of digitizing content and thinking about getting rid of the paper. Are there things, I guess the core of the question is are there things that people ought to be thinking about as they do digitization, such that they can also migrate into M365 at the same time? In other words, kill two birds with one stone. And Scott, why don't you tackle that one first?
Yeah, if you're talking about the conversion, digital conversion, prep for migration to any content, any environment, yet some of those ideas haven't changed in the last many, many years. So for those of you who remember microfilm, even with microfilm, you had to identify where a document starts and a document stops. So that's one of the key differentiators. And also the separation of those documents, playing along those same roles. The document prep before you're processing these should never be underestimated. A lot of times that kind of gets cast to the side. And when you get into these boxes, we have to obviously address stapled documents, sticky notes over top of certain forms. There's a lot of work there that needs to be done before those documents can be processed. But the other thing is, once we have those separated, is the classification. What type of a document is this? What metadata goes along with that document? Is it just a last name, first name, employee ID number? What else do we have to consider that's important to be able to retrieve that document in an efficient manner? So again, the modern platforms, 365 has that capability to search both the document contents and the metadata as well. But that assignment of metadata leads towards also the content types, if we're talking about SharePoint. And that content type obviously plays a big role moving forward when we start talking about the records management perspective.
And Olivia, give me your thoughts on this whole question of this continuum from paper to the cloud and what you ought to be thinking about there.
Well, and kind of to piggyback, and I think Scott was hopefully just setting me up for it. So when you're going to M365, one of the features that you're getting there are the digital content types, which is basically like, let's say, this is a employment application. That's always going to have certain metadata to it. So that's basically what a content type is. And so with all these different forms, you can be defining content types, and then you can start to define in your digital environment, records management, review rules, any kind of rules tied to that content type. In a single library, you might have a few different kinds of content types. Let's say it's an employee record library. And so, yeah, there may be the employment application, their annual reviews, mid-year reviews, all kinds of other documents that would have different rules, different pieces around that. And so you can control those. And Jay, you can probably speak more on to what some of the native features in M365 and then third-party products, what they can do in terms of one of the advantages of moving to the cloud is the way you can automate a lot of the compliance rules, a lot of the records management, and a lot of the routing approval or any other business process you might have.
Yeah, and so you've both like nailed the conversation about metadata, right? Bringing a document in and using OCR so that you can scan that document, that's the first obvious piece about digitizing your content. But then being able to assign metadata to it, being able to say what type of record is this, who's the owning organization, and then also, frankly, being able to identify if it's a contract, what's the contract end date. Knowing that kind of information can help you automate so much of your file plan that previously had to be very manual, that it changes the game. It's one of the reasons why NAR is pushing to digital records management instead of paper. It's not just a storage conversation and the physical buildings that are being required to store things, but it's also the ease in which you can automate the file plan, the actions, the disposition of your content. And so knowing what is this document and then creating the required metadata to properly manage that content in Microsoft 365 is huge. Whether you are looking at native or third-party requirements, it's a conversation I have all day long. You got to know what kind of license are we going to have in the destination. Now, Microsoft will tell everyone buy E5, and that is a reality in many cases. But knowing if you have E5 or E3 and knowing what comes with that, the automation capabilities, that's the first step on the capability side of knowing how successful we're going to be. And then looking at third parties for filling the gaps, whether it's a reporting gap or it's a limitation in how we're using, labels and what, how many labels we can have, or it's as an organization, are we so big that a single file plan isn't the right approach, and having different file plans for different types of organizations. So you really have to be considering those things as you have the digitization conversation, because if you don't, then you're probably just scanning your content in and you're missing the capture of the right metadata to be successful in the future. So it really comes full circle.
So, and this is for anybody, this question just popped up. As you go through the automation process, and as you look to take advantage of some of the automating capabilities that exist now that maybe didn't exist before, this person asked her, do you find that people are going back and trying to simplify some of those file plans and some of those retention schedules and, kind of this whole big buckets argument? Do you find people doing that or just wishing they could do that?
I mean, the short answer is if they're not, they're making a mistake.
Yeah, definitely. Probably a lot of wishing there, I would say, definitely. But yeah, the bigger bucket, just making your life a whole lot easier moving forward.
Yeah, and Jay, I was thinking in particular when you were talking about event-based retention schedules and disposition schedules are so problematic, because sometimes those sometimes those dates are easy to identify and automate,
Right.
and sometimes they're, it seems like nothing from a manual perspective to put that requirement in, but from an automation perspective, it becomes very problematic if that's not an easily identifiable field that you can incorporate.
One of the keys that we've identified in this specific conversation of how do I modernize my file plan is looking at the requirement in the GRS or whatever your guiding record schedule is, and trying to identify what makes sense for us. And a great example of what I mean by that is there is in the general record schedule for the federal government many requirements. I guess there are many requirements that say when no longer relevant to the business. And this is my favorite requirement because you can't quantify that. However, what we found is that most records managers and even NARA are accepting of the identification of something. And in the case that we most often find is if the rule is 7 years or no longer relevant to the business or something like that, cutting the 7 in half seems to be a pretty common accepted term. And so the question, going back to the question of, are they looking at how to modernize the record schedule, the file plan? It's absolutely required in order to be able to do this successfully, because the amount of content that is being created is too vast to rely on a records officer to be able to go through all of it.
Yeah, and this desire to automate is just so critical. Those people that have heard me speak before, my two favorite data points that are two questions that I've asked people multiple times on surveys over the last couple of years, which is that if the volume of incoming information is X right now, what do you expect it to be in 2 to 3 years? And that answer almost always comes back something between 3.5 and 4X, which is that volume question, Jay, that you're talking about. And then the second question I ask folks is, okay, if you have structured data, semi-structured content, like an invoice, say, or something like that, and unstructured information like an email system or, application files in Office or stuff like that, what percentage of that 3.5 to 4X do you think is semi-structured and unstructured? And that answer almost universally comes back 55%, 60%. So that's a really,
at least
that's a complicated stew to try to deal with. If you're relying on old manual approaches to do that. Speaking of complicated things to manage, this question just popped up about file shares, and this person said, should I be migrating my file shares into M365? And since they're so messy, Scott, why don't you? Oh no, let's Olivia, you take that one. Let's try that.
Okay.
Let's start there.
Okay. Usually there is a huge desire to migrate off of file shares. Big fan of migrating off of file shares, but it is much easier said than done. Very often file shares get, a total Wild West. Even in some of the more structured environments, they still do get, and then you have people with their personal drives with duplicate files. So what we found is going by group by group. Okay, let's take a look at this. And again, it does come back to what we were talking about earlier about identifying the content types, seeing what metadata we can pull even from the file shares, so that when we are migrating up there, especially with some of the third-party migration tools out there, we can be assigning content types as we're moving in there. And one of the things that does come up in moving off of file shares is getting off of folders and into metadata. One of the issues in Office 365, I'm sure many of you were used to, the URL limit. And anytime there's a folder, that's making the URL longer. So you kind of have to, sometimes you may, especially in some of these file shares where you've got folders within folders, 10 levels deep, you just have to get away from them. So taking a look at, okay, that folder structure, well, that may provide for us some of the metadata that's really relevant. And then how do we translate that up there, and making sure you have your Office 365, your Teams, your SharePoint environment architected correctly for that content. And also thinking of, okay, are these collaboration documents, or are these just kind of holding documents, almost like records that, we really just need to keep a hold of, but we're not working on anymore.
Jay, give me your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I lean towards the desire answer. Yes, you should absolutely look at moving your file shares to Microsoft 365. Actually, just had a customer reach out this past week and say, I am sick and tired of getting requests for more hardware to support my file shares when I'm in the middle of trying to get everyone to Microsoft 365. How do we fix this? And that's where the complexities come into play. The structure of Microsoft 365 is meant to be flat, not nested. And the structure of file shares are very nested. The question of, does it go into OneDrive or into a team or into SharePoint? There's no easy answer. I keep hitting my straw. Sorry about that. There's no easy answer for how to do that. And frankly, most migration projects are plagued by this idea of a simple migration, because we've spent so many years doing lift and shift rather than evaluating our content and deciding what should we move. So yes, you should be moving your file shares. You should be looking at what in my file shares is appropriate to go into that environment. And then once we've identified what isn't, we need to figure out why. If it's not appropriate to move into Microsoft 365, then we have to determine, is Microsoft 365 the ECM that we are talking about it being, or is there something else? Is this content, Olivia, you mentioned, is it temporary content that's ready to be disposed of? Is it departmental information, policies that needs to go in this specific location? You have to make time to evaluate that.
It's very much you should do it, but it's by no means an overnight process at all. And the bigger your file share is, the longer it's going to take. And also, going to a file share doesn't mean everything moves.
Yes.
Right. It goes. I think of the old Barney song, "Clean Up, Clean Up." For those of you who remember Barney, it's just going through those drives. I know it's it's an enormous task, and we've seen some of these engagements we've been on where our customer goes in and actually commits to this, and we'll see like a 60% reduction in content. It's just a lot of it is just, and we've seen more than that sometimes. I don't want to call it garbage. It's just things that you don't need to keep. And that's the perfect opportunity. Getting people to do that is extremely difficult. We all know that. But it's a great opportunity to clean that up. And, we've talked before as well as, do you have to move that to 365? Well, I mean, there's in-place records management as well. You can do that as well if you're not going to move to 365. But that cleanup is just, it's a huge task, but it's definitely worth it.
It is, and we've seen clean, like you mentioned that I think you said what, a 60% reduction, Scott, or we've seen very similar things. Whenever we talk about migration with customers, whether the source is a file share or it's a SharePoint on-prem solution or something else, the very first part of that is understanding what is that data. And so you might want to look for ROT, redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. After you've done that and you've determined, the items in this file that are older than 20 years that aren't identified as a record, we don't care about them, as an example. The next thing is to look at the business information about that. And we often have conversations with customers about scanning their content with relevant business rules to identify, is it a cafeteria menu? Like, we can find those really easily by putting a few keywords in our search terms. Is it a record of an employee contract? Again, really easy to find certain types of records, right? So helping them first identify the ROT, and second, identify specific known requirements for business rules to find specific types of information really does help to limit the amount of information you're looking at. Frankly, data cleanup in file shares, whether you're migrating or not, is huge. And we just don't often have we don't set the time to do it. And now that we're seeing literal exponential growth of data, it's becoming more and more important to start doing it.
And there's an interesting change management dynamic that goes there because everybody is very, very conscious of, Jay, how much garbage there is on your file share, and Olivia, how much there is on yours, and Scott, how much there is on yours. But there's certainly none on mine. And please don't monkey around. And one client I was working with, as they tried to implement automated disposition of some of the junk content on this, is that they started internally circulating hashtags like, don't touch my data, and don't, that kind of thing. And it's just very interesting how this that change management piece is, everybody thinks that their own content is much more important than everybody else's content. And you got to address those things at the same time, which gets to a question. These have been great questions, so thank you everybody for submitting them. This question is interesting to me, which is, and I get this all the time too, which is, why should I even bother getting rid of all the rot? Suppose there's some nugget of gold in that rot that I can't find right now, but in 5 years with AI and machine learning, I'll be able to find it. Why shouldn't I just keep everything? Who wants to address that one?
Oh, I can take a first stab at that. I mean, it's a little bit different, I think, when we're talking about the previous lift and shifts, and obviously that's something that we still do today. But when we're going, and Olivia, I'm gonna push this over to you and Jay as well. But when we talk about moving to a 365 type environment rather than the lift and shift, I mean, there's a lot of things that come into play with that. And I think one of those main items is the architecture. So we're used to having our site collections and then our subsites. In this case, we're typically looking at more of a flat architecture, right? It's typically what we see when we start these initiatives.
Yeah, and I was going to say, what you were bringing up that, well, in 5 years, AI, machine learning will find it. With the capabilities now on the cloud, you don't even necessarily have to wait 5 years. If there was the nugget of gold, clean it up as best you can. But once you get it up there, you're going to see oh, okay, this is more useful, or, oh, wait, no, this really isn't. I mean, I had worked on one project where luckily their legal and compliance team was very involved in the cleanup, and they sort of did their take on Marie Kondo's "Does it bring me joy?" That is it going to bring a lawsuit? If it's going to bring a lawsuit to get rid of, you don't get rid of. If otherwise, they're we're not. It doesn't come in the first pass.
Is it going to put me on the front page of the Washington Post? That's a common question we ask.
Yeah, does it spark a lawsuit? Yeah, and it's if it sparks a new lawsuit, get rid of it.
So one of the interesting things that many non-technologists don't realize is that there are limitations to how well Microsoft 365 will work if you don't reorganize your architecture and if you don't clean up your content. Primary example, if your content is more than 3 levels deep, search probably isn't going to pick it up.
Yep.
And so if you have a site collection and then a subsite, and then maybe 2 or 3 more subsites, and then you go into a document library, and then you have a nested folder there, search isn't going to find that content, period. It's well documented, and it is something that Microsoft has really pushed, that organizations restructure their data. And frankly, the reason is I can't imagine a day when AI is both smart enough to be able to dig through all of that and kind enough to not remove the human element altogether. So restructuring that data with that kind of consideration in mind is huge. It's near impossible to manage an environment where you are subsite, trying to be concerned about permissions, trying to be concerned about finding that nugget of gold. It's just something that you can't accomplish. And 20 plus years of SharePoint has proven that. So that's where there's evidence to say you need to take the time to go through this.
And I do think it helps with user adoption when you do have the structured data. Because let's say I want to see things grouped by fiscal year and customer.
Yep.
And Scott needs to see it by state and account ID. We're looking at the same documents. We're just seeing it in a way that's relevant to us, which reduces the need for me to download this in environments that make more sense to me and everyone off doing their own thing. So there's a big win, I think, as much as people get nervous and anxious about the idea of flattening everything out. When you do it right, there's a huge win, and it allows a lot more individual flexibility and individual control over how you see your documents.
Right.
This question,
very different look.
This question's a little bit off from the migration question, but I thought I'd tee it up for everybody anyway. The question basically is along the lines of, I went through SharePoint sprawl 10 years ago because we deployed SharePoint very quickly without really thinking too much about it. My organization just did the same thing with Teams because we all had to work remotely. At a pretty common problem that organizations are going to face a year, 2 years, 3 years from now.
Oh, they're already facing it.
Yep.
One of my favorite, we deployed Teams without any governance conversations right now. It was about a year ago we heard this. It's a defense organization. They turned it on. They had 20,000 teams in a matter of 3 months. The majority of those teams were test sites, and a high number of them had disturbing names as the titles, mentioning particularly high-ranking individuals and adjectives that I can't say. And so the idea that you're going to have a platform like Microsoft 365, which is designed for open collaboration, and not have some form of governance controls, not have some thought process to how do we guide people to using it correctly, not have a concept of when you create this kind of a team, expect these types of records and therefore stand up the defaults for those categories. Like, not doing that, you're absolutely going to be in worse case than you were with SharePoint. Because at least with SharePoint, we could say, this is your little sandbox, you can't go out of it.
Yeah, the other thing I find, and it's kind of astounding, but it's a reality, is that a lot of organizations don't realize that when you're, setting up teams, this is the power of it too. So I'm not trying to denigrate it, but you have to think about it, is that, you're setting up SharePoint instances and OneDrive instances and, and that stuff needs to be managed in some way, shape, or form, because otherwise it's just going to be, you'll be back in the rot business really, really quickly. All right, well, we're almost out of time, and I'm going to switch gears from the audience questions. Let me just check one more time for any more. Okay, we're clear, and ask you one of my questions, which I always refer to this. There are different versions of this question that I've asked in different forums over the years, which is my country and Western question, which my country Western version is, what do you know now that you wish you knew then when it comes to migration? The question, the way to phrase this, maybe that another way of phrasing this is that, Jay, you're on day 2 of let's just assume a 1-day migration project.
Right.
And which, years might be a better time frame to think about some of this. But anyway, you're on day 2. What do you all of a sudden realize on day 2 that you should have done along the way? What's typical?
There are so many things. And every time I have this conversation, I feel like I have a different answer. So I apologize right off the bat if you've heard me talk about this and you're hearing me say something different today. The first piece of that answer is, depending on what Microsoft enclave you're in, commercial, GCC, GCC high, DoD, the capabilities are different. So do a little research as to what is available in your enclave. And it's not an easy task because the documentation is not always explicitly clear in what isn't available. They try. They're doing a much better job today than they were doing 3 to 5 years ago. But that's a big one, is you have to do a little research. And I highly recommend picking up a partner that has done this a number of times, because that partner is going to be able to say, you're in GCC. Here are some gotchas you really should know about. The other part of that, and I think we talked about it a little bit, is don't wait until day 2 to design your architecture or design your governance. Because if you wait until day 2, you've already moved your content. And that one day took a long time, I'm sure. If you haven't moved it into the right structure, good luck getting your users to agree to move it after you've completed it, right? There's a number of considerations for what do I do with it now that we're here that should have been made previously.
Awesome. Olivia, how about you?
This is doubly true on any M365, especially SharePoint Online migration, especially for government clients, but true of really any migration. Who is really on the communication lists and the communication plans, and who's getting notified? So many times it has been like the directors, management being notified, and the people who are actually in the documents doing the work, especially with some of those more high touch pieces, and the people who have to find these documents, people who may be doing records work, they weren't told a thing. And so they, it's day 2 and they're like, wait, what happened? And we were told it was happening, but we didn't see anything.
Yeah.
So kind of learning to push back a little bit on directors of management of like, hey, here's the people we notice of this content that's coming over. Here are the people who touch it the most. Can we, show them the mock-up of the site, make sure they're like, okay, yeah, this makes sense. Because I do think from also a user adoption standpoint, if you get one of the, worker bees there, who's now the kind of train the trainer person, that does help everyone else feel a lot more comfortable. So I think making sure that communication plan includes the people who are actually going in there for something other than reports and dashboards.
And that's that change management set of issues that we talked about. Just, if you don't embrace people that are actually doing the work, you're going to pay for it later on. Scott, how about you? Day 2.
Yeah, I'm going to go with a technical item. So the years, I keep going back to the years of microfilm and, all this content we're bringing into these systems. And I've seen too many times when we go in to do an assessment that although we have some of our architecture down, within the libraries, we're not using content types. It's just a drop off for data without actually classifying it within the whole tenant. And I think that's very detrimental. I think it becomes a more painful issue when you're going from environment to environment, even if whether you're going into a Microsoft based or out of it. We just see a lot of instances where the time isn't taken. It goes back to the planning, the architecture planning. There's just not enough time spent on that to make sure that we're classifying everything correctly, accurately, because that's going to make our life so much easier moving forward. I just think it's one little item that's often overlooked.
So, and for me, and I guess I get the last word since I'm teed myself up as the last speaker. So first of all, thank you guys for being with us, and audience, thank you for being with us as well. My day 2 thing is that I think automation is a double-edged sword. And what I mean by that is that particularly in an M365 context, the automation capabilities that now exist relative to retention management and disposition management and records management and the whole portfolio of governance and compliance capabilities are extremely powerful. But going back to what Jay said, in the wrong hands and not really thoughtfully implemented, it can be a disaster downstream if you don't really think about that architecture question on the front end, and if you don't address the kinds of user issues that Olivia was talking about. And so just remember that automation is terrifically powerful, and respect it. Make sure that you automate in a way that is architecturally and strategically sound for your organization. So thank you all very much for everybody. We really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us today. See you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.